choked with plants that the rest of humankind has shunned, pervaded by the narcotic perfumes of poisonous blossoms. A witch's garden embodied a perverse understanding of nature. No natural thing is essentially evil, but evil ends make evil means. For as long as I can remember, I have been growing plants in whichever space I had available. The first flowers I ever grew were violas, pretty purple and yellow blooms that grew outside the front door of the haunted house in which I grew up. They taught me the secret magic of resilience, growing even with cigarette ash and butts dumped on them. And through the years I learned much about plants and gardening from my Oma, who had a knack for growing orchids and roses and a myriad of other stunning green things. So it is perhaps no surprise that my own path gradually led me towards the world of magical herbalism, and in particular the poison path. It is equally unsurprising that Under the Dragon Root, along with the first two books in Corinne Boyer's Botanical trilogy, eventually found their way into my hands. As my own practice became increasingly rooted in folklore and in the relationships with the more than human world, including that of the verdant beings, I had found myself searching for books that moved beyond lists of correspondences and magical ingredients. I was looking for something that treated plants as living beings, with their own histories, personalities, and places within the folklore that surrounds them. Boyer's trilogy does just that, approaching plants from a deeply folkloric witchcraft perspective. Like the first two books in this trilogy, Under the Dragon Root explores the folklore, historical associations, folk medicine, and traditional witchcraft surrounding 20 plants long associated with the witch's garden, including the dark nightshades, mandrake, belladonna, henbane, and datura. The chapters are arranged according to the turning of the seasons, following the natural rhythms of the plants themselves and the traditional times in which they were gathered, worked with, and woven into folklore. While I was naturally drawn to the familiar witching herbs of the nightshade family, it was Boyer's chapters on Hellebore, Periwinkle, and Fern that drew me back into the garden, even through the stillness and gloom of winter, encouraging me to look more deeply into the long shadows of the underworld. Hellebore is an otherworldly plant and flower, so handsome in late winter with its leathery evergreen leaves and stunning flowers that beg one to get closer. Absolute perfection with bold details in this hearty bloom, yet she lacks all fragrance, like flowers fit for the dead. Hellebore has always been one of my favorite winter plants, and one I have developed a particular relationship with. Yet somewhere along the way, through moves from one cottage to another, a spell in an apartment, and finally to the home where I live now, I lost her. For years I searched for a nursery that stocked hellebores, but with no success, and eventually I accepted that I might simply never grow one again. Even my hellebore El Rawn became neglected over the years, as increasingly difficult life circumstances left little room for anything beyond simply surviving. Adornment and offerings do nothing to soften this plant's harsh manner and icy rapport. What does she want then, this queen of winter flora, this unequalled beauty in the dark months forlorn? Perhaps give her a heart, and then see what one can see. Reading Boyer's chapter on hellebore stirred something I hadn't realized I had been grieving. After I closed the book, I reached into my altar, lifted the little box which held my Elrawn, and fed her root once more. It was both a sorrowful and joyful ritual. It had been so long since I had kissed the root, so long since I had held her in my hands, that the moment felt like coming home. The next morning I set out to looking for a new supplier of hellebore, and found one, and now I have a beautiful little hellebore growing happily in my garden again. Boyer's chapter on hellebore explores its long history as a magical plant, tracing its associations back to the writings of Pliny and Dioscorides. Traditionally, hellebore was valued for its protective qualities, with the plant being sprinkled or grown around the home as a means of guarding against harmful forces. She also explores the lesser-known witch lore surrounding hellebore, including its appearance in witch trial records as an ingredient in flying ointments. As with the other chapters in this book, Boyer's research is extensive and carefully referenced, bringing together historical sources, folklore, and magical traditions to create a rich portrait of the plant. Throughout each chapter, Boyer also gives glimpses into her own practices with these plants, ending with rituals that feel like invitations to deepen one's relationship with them and our own craft. In the case of Hellebore, she offers a ritual for creating a vessel for the dead. Boyer's rituals, like many found in books on traditional craft, have sometimes been criticized for being difficult to carry out in our modern urban lives. However, I find that they serve as inspiration, and where practical or safety concerns arise, rituals can often be adapted while still preserving their intention. The Vessel of the Dead ritual is a particularly accessible example, requiring little beyond a flowering hellebore and a respectful visit to a graveyard. We have the receipt of fern seed, we walk invisible. Boyer's chapter on the fern is one of my favorites, partly because I've had to make peace with the fact that my garden is mostly shade, where ferns thrive more readily than some other plants, and partly because even as far back as my childhood, there's always been something deeply mystical about them. My Oma had a section of her garden which was called the fairy garden, and it was a small alcove with stepping stones, moss, fuchsias, and ferns. It was a magical little spot in which I spent much of my time. It was not surprising then to learn that ferns have an association with the fairies of Cornwall. Boyer writes that there was a tale called The Fairy Widower that told of a woman who met a man at the crossroads after plucking some fern leaves. He granted her a wish if she swore on the fern leaf to take care of his son for a year and a day, as he was a widower. The young woman had been looking for work and agreed to his conditions. She swore on the fern leaf and followed him eastwards. Once walking for miles and becoming weary, the man passed a bunch of leaves before her face, and suddenly they were in fairyland. She loved the little child under her care, and enjoyed her stay for a year and a day. Eventually she woke in her own bed, after being taken away to fairyland. Alongside this piece of fairy lore, one of my favorite traditions surrounding the fern is the midsummer rite in which the devil himself appears, both as guardian and as wild adversary. Boyer draws fascinating comparisons between this tradition and the toad-bone rite, a ritual I explored in my video essay on the toad in witchcraft, tracing the many variations of the practice across different cultures and periods. Across Slavic tradition, it is said that on Kupala Night, the ancient midsummer festival, the fern blooms for a single fleeting moment. Whoever is fortunate enough to find this flower is said to be granted great wisdom, wealth, or hidden knowledge. Of course, ferns do not flower at all, nor do they produce seed, and perhaps that is precisely the point. The fern flower belongs to the place where folklore slips quietly into the other world. This coming midsummer, I hope to honor my own Polish roots by observing the Kupala Night tradition myself, and perhaps the rite will take me to that half-there world to search for the sacred fern flower. For those willing to meet the devil beneath the pale light of a midsummer moon, the old trackways are still there, winding quietly through these pages. The chapter concludes with a ritual for crafting a fern invisibility ointment, a potent unguent rooted in the very heart of fern folklore. It is a fitting ending, bringing together the plant's associations with hidden parts, secret knowledge, and the unseen world. Periwinkle is a funerary plant of old, often planted on the graves of children of the young. Garlands of periwinkle were placed on the coffins of children from Italy. A Dutch name, Machtenpalm, translates to virgin's palm, referring to placing a wreath of the flowers and twigs on the maiden's funeral bier. From Wales, it was very unlucky to uproot one of these plants from the grave. If this was done, one would risk being haunted by the person buried there. A few years ago, a fellow folk witch spoke about periwinkle and its use as a protective herb. The post stayed with me because it arrived at a time when I felt the need to batten down the hatches. Life was getting rough, and I found myself moving through a season of difficult transitions, uncertainty, and loss. I made a note of her video, intending to return to it, But as so often happens, life got in the way and the video is no longer available. Reading Boyer's chapter on periwinkle immediately brought that memory back, along with my long-held desire to grow the plant myself. In South Africa, the plant most commonly found in our gardens is Catharanthus roseus, rather than one of the creeping vinca species. While it can serve as a fitting substitute, it was always the vinca that captured my imagination, with its delicate periwinkle blue flowers. It is a color I have loved since childhood, my favorite crayon in the box. And one day, while not really paying too much attention, I found myself looking over the flowers in the parking lot at work and saw growing there in all her glory vinca. I have taken some cuttings and I'm now waiting for them to root. In folklore, periwinkle was valued as a quiet guardian against the unseen. Its leaves were associated with protection from nightmares, and it was also carried or worn as a charm against witchcraft, the evil eye, and malicious spirits, earning names such as sorcerer's violet in some traditions. Periwinkle was sometimes hung in stables to guard livestock from harmful magic. For all my love of the dead, ghosts, and graveyards, the deathly folklore and associations of Vinca are deeply fascinating to me. Among the many traditions Boyer records is an old folk divination using the periwinkle flower to foretell the number of years one has left to live, a charmingly macabre piece of folklore for those of us with a morbid curiosity. This chapter ends with a ritual for a love divination, for periwinkle is also associated with love, as well as a fumigation for the dead. Periwinkle offers hope to those whom have lost love to death and to abandonment, and it also acts to strengthen the bonds of those still with us. Through my focus on these particular plants and chapters, I have hoped to show how deeply interwoven these folk practices and relationships with plants are within my own life. While I could happily wax lyrical about the nightshades, and I'm sure I will in time, it was a different group of plants entirely that awoke in me forgotten memories, old loves, and parts of my own practice that had been quietly waiting to be rediscovered. That is why books like Boyer's mean so much to me. They cannot replace a living tradition, but they preserve fragments of one. They are threads connecting us to generations of people who knew these plants, feared them, healed with them, and wove them into the stories they told about the world.